In this video, I'm going to cover what I consider to be the three most important concepts to unlocking the Soulsborne franchise, and to successfully breach the high skill floor that the series demands. These three concepts are bosses, dodging, and death. Two of these concepts are both heavily related to a shift in mindset while playing these games, a shift that, in my experience, revealed a genuine appreciation and love for these games. If you've ever attempted to play these games and could never seem to get into it, or if you've never tried and are worried about the dreaded difficulty that everyone seems to talk about, then this video is for you. If you're already a fan of these games, I'll still be discussing interesting psychological topics that may encourage you to approach these games with a different view. My goal with this video is to get as many people playing these games as possible, so for that reason, I will not be showing any major spoilers from these games. I highly recommend you play these games blind, as it can easily be one of, if not the greatest experience you will ever have while gaming. Dark Souls is one of the greatest video game franchises of our generation. The series has literally changed the way certain game genres are designed, and has made massive waves in the indie game world, with the term Souls-like becoming synonymous with difficulty. This difficulty, however, has the unfortunate consequence of making it nearly impossible for a new player to ease their way into the game without immense frustration and an incredibly demanding skill floor. Hopefully this video can help with that. So without further ado, let me give you a quick recap of my Souls journey, which, if you've tried to get into these games before, you can probably relate to. I started my adventure with Bloodborne, and while I loved the theme and the world, I ended up giving up on the first main boss and didn't return to the series until Dark Souls 3 about a year later and had similar results. I absolutely adored the aesthetic and lore, but just couldn't get past the insane difficulty. I left the series thinking, wow, this game is not even fair. These bosses are stupid and unbalanced. Some time had passed, and I tried one more time and persisted until I made it past the first few bosses and started to get somewhat of a feel for the game. I was absolutely loving it. Exploring and becoming fully immersed in the world of Dark Souls 3 is still one of my favorite memories to this day. However, the mid-game bosses started to become real roadblocks for me, and I was struggling to not get frustrated at every new boss fight I encountered, until one day, something clicked. A common misconception in Souls games is that the bosses are hard for the sake of being hard, and that to win, you just have to throw yourself at a boss over and over until you somehow miraculously win. This was my mentality, at least, when I first entered the series, and after my first experience with Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, this idea was kind of burned into my mind. What a lot of people don't understand is that one of the biggest gameplay loops of Souls games is learning how to defeat a boss. This is also what keeps many players playing FromSoftware's games so religiously. To beat a difficult boss in a Souls game, you have to put forth some amount of effort to learn how to counter them. You have to be mindful in your attempts and take mental notes of things that you notice. For example, on this attack, he swings a little slower than I expected, so next time I need to slightly delay my dodge. Or, he seems to have a long wind down after using this attack, so next time I'm going to try to hit him during that period and see what happens. Learning when you are able to attack a boss is key to getting sufficient damage in before you are completely drained of your Estus. This also applies in the same way to learning when you can heal and when you can't. Bloodborne teaches this concept perfectly. Having the fastest pace of all the Soulsborne games, Bloodborne incentivizes speed and aggression. So much so that when you take a hit in Bloodborne, there's a very small window afterwards where landing hits will actually regain some of that health. You are practically forced to memorize the boss's windows of opportunity, as they are much thinner and more rewarding than the other Souls games. This kind of mindful thinking is the foundation of any learning process, but isn't very expected in video games. You're used to being spoon-fed the tools and knowledge to beat a part of a game, which isn't a bad thing. This mindful approach to boss fights is one of my favorite things about Souls games. It keeps the player extremely mentally engaged and, more importantly, allows you to constantly feel a sense of progression, even when, at the surface level, you're just getting pummeled over and over. I can count on my fingers the number of bosses that, even after multiple successful runs, I consider to have a move that is genuinely unfair. Like, no matter how much I think, Google for help, or attempt to implement wild strategies, there is no way to counter it. And that goes to show FromSoftware's mastery in designing good fights. Even the bosses that are considered the absolute hardest in the game have been killed at level 1 while taking no damage whatsoever. That wouldn't be possible if every boss was unfair like many players tend to think. They may have frustrating abilities or seemingly impossible windows of opportunity for attack, but with enough mindful execution and practice, you will begin to see how little bosses there are that are genuinely unfair. Dodging is something that can be your best friend or your worst enemy. Many new players instinctively use their dodge as soon as they see the slightest hint of movement from an enemy, and it leads to them getting hit by the tail end of the attack. Coming from other titles with sword-based dodging combat, a lot of players have the mindset that pressing the dodge button by itself is enough to get by, and most of the time it is. Due to having a much farther dodge range and length of invincibility, games such as Legend of Zelda or God of War allow you to not worry as much about dodging at the right time or direction. But Dark Souls is different. Your dodge is much shorter and needs to have much more intention behind it. The enemies have long windups that often play against your natural instinct to get out of danger. You know the danger is coming, and you want to get out of there as fast as possible. This leads to something known as panic dodging, where you spam your dodge over and over in a desperate attempt to not get hit, but you have to fight that urge, and wait out the animation until the last possible second before you get hit. It's also important to understand that the direction that you dodge is extremely important. The long windups that certain enemies have on their attacks is not just there to mess with your timing, it's also there to show you the direction that the attack is going, and to give you the necessary information to determine which direction you need to dodge. Learning to do this consistently will lead to much more success while fighting enemies and bosses, but more importantly, it will give you a sense of control when you're fighting. This feeling of control can oftentimes elevate Dark Souls combat to another level, and make it begin to feel more like a dance between you and the enemy. This feeling becomes obvious when you revisit an earlier boss after finishing the game, and you don't feel the same sense of urgency or panic anymore. You know this boss, and can dodge most of its attacks like clockwork, with more intentional dodging while simultaneously weaving in attacks at just the right times. This back and forth interaction between you and the boss is an amazing feeling, and it's reproducible in every fight, with enough patience and willingness to learn and adapt. Most bosses in Souls game evolve during the fight. After their health gets to a certain threshold, they get a new attack, or one of their attacks becomes more potent than before, and you can often feel the sense of constant progression and dance-esque interaction throughout your attempts as you get closer and closer to defeating them. Let's use Udex Gundyr, the first boss of Dark Souls 3 as an example. In his first phase, he is a typical humanoid-style enemy that strikes at you with a spear. His attacks are very telegraphed and have a clear sense of direction and well-defined hitboxes. With enough time, you can learn to dodge his attacks and start to get some hits in, but once he gets to around half health, he transformed into a monstrous being with a completely different set of moves. But by the time you can consistently make it to his second phase and have to start learning to dodge his new moves, you are probably becoming quite familiar and comfortable dealing with this first moveset. This is when you start to feel it, the control that comes from mastering a boss. His first phase becomes an afterthought, something that you try to perfect in order to maximize the amount of Estus you have left for the second phase. You can apply this process of perfecting something to most parts of Souls games as well, such as the sections in between boss fights, or the runbacks to boss fights after. A common critique of Souls games is that the punishment for dying is too harsh, considering you are supposed to die. When you die, you lose your souls, which are both your experience points and money, and they stay where you died, and you get one more chance to run back and pick them up. If you die again before picking them up, then you lose them permanently. This sounds terrible on paper, but eventually, you start to realize that the souls actually don't matter as much as you think they do. The souls you collect in between boss fights are a fairly minuscule amount compared to the amount that bosses themselves give. One boss fight can give you multiple levels worth of souls, easily making up for anything you may have lost along the way. Not to mention the item that the bosses drop themselves, which can either be transformed into a unique weapon from that boss, or, if you have no interest in that weapon, can be consumed for a large amount of souls. If you're comfortable doing so, I definitely recommend checking the wiki or the respective vendor in-game to see if these items are of any interest to you. And remember, you can always get them again in your next playthrough, so don't think they'll be locked away forever just because you aren't interested in them right now. In between boss fights, you will also find an abundance of consumable items that can be turned into free souls to help you level up even more. I find that these are most helpful for topping off when I'm just short of a level up. If you have a ton of souls and don't know how far the next bonfire is, consider using an item to teleport back to a bonfire and spend them. It's much better to backtrack a little bit than to stress over losing that amount of souls. But the important thing to remember is that dying twice and losing your souls can actually be a positive thing sometimes. When you lose the thing that you were so nervous about losing, you can reapproach the area with no stakes and way less stress. These areas in between bosses also bring a great opportunity for optimization in your gameplay, especially with the games in the series that provide you with an Estus Flask or a refillable source of healing. These games being Dark Souls 1, 3, Sekiro, and Elden Ring, where resting at a bonfire or a similar site will refill your healing item back to full charges, and the challenge is making it to the next bonfire before you run out. Many people dislike the idea of a run back to a boss fight each time you die, and I won't lie to you, some boss runbacks are pretty ridiculous. Looking at you, Bed of Chaos. But there are many different ways to optimize the runbacks to boss fights. Most areas have shortcuts that allow you to cut down on the time it takes to reach the bosses that you may have just not found yet. These areas between boss fights have some of the best parts of the Souls games. You can really see all the attention to detail that the creators put into some of these zones, and Even though they may not be as mentally stimulating as a fast-paced boss fight, they can be equally captivating and magical. Dark Souls 1 definitely manages to accomplish this the best, and is famous for having some of the best world design in any video game. With the first half of the game having no fast travel, and no minimap or quest markers to guide you on where to go, your first time exploring through some of the areas in this game are unbelievably memorable. I won't go into too much detail in this video as many creators have covered this before, but there are moments in Dark Souls where you go down an elevator or open a door and find yourself back in an area that you haven't seen in hours, and it clicks in your head just how connected this whole world is. I don't know of any game that has created such a beautifully interconnected world where each area seamlessly flows into each other. Dark Souls 1 easily has the most profound blind playthrough experience of the Souls series because of this reason. To reach this point though, and have such a glass half full mentality, you need to do something that a lot of people won't like to hear. Lose your ego. Anger is futile. Dying means that you did something wrong and you have the opportunity to learn from it. Sure, it can be upsetting to lose, but if you find yourself being filled with rage every time you die, this used to be me, then maybe you need to come in with a different point of view. You're going to die. A lot. Learn to love the process and sense of progression you get from each attempt. This feeling of control and mastery that comes from it will make it all worthwhile. At the end of the day, it's still a video game. You're supposed to have fun with it, so try putting yourself in the shoes of players who love the series, or the developers who intentionally made things the way they are. Why do they like this thing that I hate? Maybe you just need to look at it from a different perspective. Or maybe we're all just masochists. Who knows? Hopefully, if you've made it this far, you have a little bit more motivation to go give Dark Souls one more try with a new mindset. And who knows, maybe this time something will click and you'll also find a new favorite series.